Are we on, Daniel, or are we waiting a second song?
You're good. That was our second song.
Start now?
Yep.
Okay. Hello again and welcome back, everybody. Have a nice lunch. We're doing a breakout session today with 3 students from the Yale and Slavery Seminar conducted by our colleagues at Rugemer and Crystal Feimster. And to chair and moderate this conversation among the students in that course who will be talking about their own research is Risë Nelson. Risë has been a very important member of our working group on Yale and slavery. She serves as the Dean of Yale, Assistant Dean of Yale College and Director of Yale's Afro-American Cultural Center. And she's also created here at Yale a program called the History Keepers Program, through which students learn about and help preserve the histories of Blacks at Yale. It's a joint initiative between the Cultural Center, the University Library, and the Smithsonian and the Beinecke. It provides mentoring, workshops, internships, culturally based experiential learning, and it's a great chance for the students to do serious research in Yale's archives. Risë also, I must say, helped us organize a student panel, big public panel we did last winter, actually, as we were launching this project with student leaders at Yale. Risë indeed helped us put that together and to manage it. So without further ado, enjoy your lunch, everybody, but over to you, Risë, and thank you so much for doing this.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. And thank you to your entire team who have helped put this conference together, especially Michelle Zaks and Daniel Vieira. And before we jump into our session, I do want to offer a few other acknowledgements, which I think are very important. I first want to acknowledge the Quinnipiac Nation, upon whose unceded land Yale has built this community and university for students to learn and to grow. For when we acknowledge the traditional land that we stand on, we recognize a longer, fuller, and richer story that informs our present. I would also like to dedicate this session to the enslaved Black men who helped build Connecticut Hall, the oldest building on our campus. That's Jethro and Gad Luke, Jack, Dick, Mingo, George, enslaved by Yale President Thomas Clapp, and a gentleman who was enslaved by one Mr. Bontecu, and whose name we do not yet know. We thank also the scores of other enslaved Black women and men whose names we will hopefully learn for the countless ways that they built up this university and its students, faculty, and administrators. I also want to acknowledge Professor Blassingame, a historian and a true pioneer in the study of American slavery, and for his involvement of students in the research process, many of whom came from the Afro-American Cultural Center and African American Studies. I'm not sure that that we would even be holding this amazing conference without his contributions to this field. And speaking of students, I want to also recognize the nearly dozen student research assistants to Yale and Slavery Working Group, the 3 doctoral students who produced the original Yale Slavery and Abolition report that was published by the Amistad Committee in 2001, as well as 2 of my center's history keepers, Rye Walker and Rebecca Amanor, whose research on the proposed Negro College and on slavery-related nomenclature at Pearson College, respectively, they've been just tremendous sources of information to the working group and to this conference. Our students truly embraced Yale's motto of Lux et Veritas, or light and truth, as they cast bright light on these ugly truths and bring us into the conversation of where do we go from here. These students and other Yale students through the past decades especially have been just vital in the scholarship and understanding of legacies of slavery here, and will be critical in the planning for reparations and action items for our future. So here we are to talk about the experience of studying slavery and race at Yale through the course of this name, taught by Professors Crystal Feimster and Ed Rugemer, who we'll also hear from a little bit later. And this course, taught jointly by from the Departments of African American Studies and History, was designed to facilitate student participation in the Yale and Slavery Research Project. Course participants have conceived and are conducting independent research on a topic related to the course theme and will present their findings to the course along with their 20 to 25 page papers. I'll remind all of our attendees today that closed captioning is available, so you can enable that by clicking on the little CC button at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any questions for our Q&A session, which we'll hold at the end, please feel free to type those into the chat for us to select from. All right, so let's get into it. I'm going to introduce our panelists, Bhasha, Donasia, and Patrick. Bhasha Chakrabarti is an artist who has been based, in Honolulu, New York, New Delhi, and now New Haven. She's currently pursuing her master's degree in fine arts at the Yale School of Art in the painting and printmaking department. By crossing many genres, including painting, weaving, and quilt making, her practice generates dialogues between subaltern tropes and labor histories in the global South and resistance movements of minorities and marginalized communities in the North. She's interested in art making as a mode of discourse and as a way to mend and suture societal wounds. Donasia Gray is a junior in Yale College, majoring in African-American studies with a concentration on abolition in post-colonial spaces, and she's a scholar in the Yale Education Studies program. She was born and raised in New Hallville, a neighborhood of New Haven, which sparked her interest in town and gown relations. And as someone who primarily focuses on the civil rights movement to the present day, Donasia was drawn to the Slavery, Race, and Yale course for its pre-20th century focus to further contextualize the Yale-New Haven relationship today. Outside of the classroom, Donasia interns for the Dixwell Community Q House, grand opening soon, works for the Yale Undergraduate Admissions Office, co-coordinates a direct service program with the Yale Undergraduate Prison Project, and dances with Steppin' Out, and she is also on the rugby team. And Patrick Hayes is a sophomore in Yale College from Arkadelphia, Arkansas. He plans on studying history with a focus on poverty and inequality in the American South. He interns at Data Haven, which is a New Haven nonprofit that analyzes and publicizes data on well-being and equity, where he focuses on economic security. So we're just going to jump into our questions here, and if each one of you can take a few moments to talk about each one of these questions. First one, simple. Can you talk a little bit about why you enrolled in this course?
I'm happy to go first. So I actually primarily enrolled in this course because the topic of race in Yale was already something that I was looking into in my own work. And of course, in addition to experiencing every day in my life as a student of color in this institution, and as an artist, I suppose you can say that work and life boundaries are few and far between. And because I have a very research-intensive art practice, this class is giving me a chance to do the research which I need to pursue for my MFA thesis in a sort of supported and robust environment where I could be guided by Professor Feimster, Professor Rugemer, and our amazing TA, Tiana Reed, while also finding connections with research being done by other students in the class. And another motivation of mine was because, especially being a graduate student and a practicing artist based here, I see myself as not only a student, but also a member of the New Haven community, and understanding the history of this place and institution are essential to how I feel I can be a more active and responsible member of this community.
Thank you. Donasia, what about you?
Hello. For me, I took the course for a number of reasons, largely because it kind of was the next culmination of all the things that I was interested in. This is going back quite far, but my interest in African-American studies and education studies really stems from the educational opportunities I've been able to have in New Haven, and really recognizing the ways in which they've allowed me to be on the path that I am, and thinking about how the same educational opportunities that I have now, weren't always afforded to people and still aren't afforded to many people in the exact same community that I grew up in, really made me want to explore that a lot more. So I ended up coming to Yale on the heels of, I remember 2015 and the entire renaming of Calhoun College to Grace Hopper, and learning about different student activism that was present on campus. So that really inspired me. And when I came here, I decided I really wanted to get involved in a lot of those student activist efforts. So I did some stuff with the Black Students for Disarmament at Yale. I've door knocked with New Haven Rising. And after being a part of a lot of these campaigns and calling on Yale to take a lot of these actions, I really wanted to be able to go back and further contextualize a lot of this work in the pre-20th century, as I stated in my introduction. Further, I also really want to take this class as someone who has done work in diversity, equity, and inclusion in the past year, as well as stuff with the admissions office. I just started noticing some things that I found a little bit curious, like the way we talked about President Theodore Dwight Woolsey and his statue, and talked about the fact that he was one of the few presidents of a Northern university to not send Southern students to fight in the Civil War as an ode to Yale's intellectual and ideological diversity, when that was a war that was about slavery. And that's not really a thing that we should be like, I don't know, in my conception, I didn't really see that as a point of pride in the university, but that is something that then connects to the ways in which the university wanted to bring together Northern and Southern students and needed to draw on the money of Southern students following the Civil War. And then I also saw that in the way that we talked about the Civil War Memorial in Schwarzman Center, and still do to this day. So I just really wanted to kind of become even further critical of the things that I'm saying and learning as I go about my daily operations, thinking about the architecture in the city of New Haven as I take urban studies classes, and thinking about who the laborers who built a lot of these buildings are. So I think this class really has allowed me to delve deeper into that and just be a lot more aware of it. And I'm really excited to be able to share that with others, and also think about how that translates into action.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you. And Patrick, let's hear from you.
So kind of opposite to Donasia, this class has been more of a starting point for me with the relationship between Yale and New Haven. As a sophomore, I was only in New Haven for the fall semester last year. And while I felt like I got a decent understanding of some of the things that go on, I really wanted to take this class as an opportunity to participate in research that's ongoing. And not to just look back and say, oh, well, this thing kind of happened, but to really participate in something where we're critically examining the failure of an institution like Yale, not just the failure, but really the perpetuation, their active encouragement and participation in human slavery is something that needs to be changed. And as a white guy, right, I'm coming at this from a different perspective. My family hasn't personally been impacted by these things in the same way that others have. But I think at the same time, if I'm able to come from a little town in the rural South and have an education at Yale, then I need to be using that education to really critically examine what's going on in this country, right? Because the story of Yale isn't just, a one-off thing. It's not like Yale was really bad and then everyone in the United States were a bunch of angels. And so I think that being able to start research on the legacies of slavery at Yale is something that you can expand to a broader place. But as a student at Yale, I feel like I've had a unique opportunity to look at in my own institution, in this place that's my home for 4 years, how my participation in it affects the ongoing legacies of structural racism in the United States.
Said, thank you. Thank you. And you all submitted your research proposals just last week, so I know that this is still pretty new, but can you tell us a little bit about them? What motivated your interest in these topics, and maybe if you have any initial findings that you can share with us? Would you like to start, Bhasha?
Sure. I feel like I'm always having to go first, which is interesting. But yeah, I think to talk about my project, I'm going to be doing a deep dive into the contents of Elihu Yale's 1718 donation to the collegiate school, which established Yale College. And I'll be looking at how the material contents of this original donation embodies deep and deliberate entanglements with not only the British colonial project in India and the Indian Ocean slave trade, but also with the Atlantic slave trade. Records show that the donation consisted of 417 books and a painting, which were retained by the college, and 3 bales of textiles from India that were sold to raise money for the university, including like 18 pieces of calico, 12 pieces of poplin, 5 pieces of plain muslin, and many more. The absence of sort of cash or currency or gold or silver in this donation made by Mr. Yale is what caught my eye. And it is explained by the fact that at this time, cloth made in India was most commonly used as like a stand-in for currency because it had a reliable trading value in the global market. I wanted to demonstrate through my research that Indian textiles, like the ones received and sold in Boston by Yale College, were highly valued, largely not just for their material finesse and aesthetic beauty, but because they were the most important goods traded by English and European merchants in Africa in exchange for enslaved people to be sent to plantations in America and the West Indies. And there's been like a really long history of deprioritizing the material and labor histories of cloth, and rather to see it as a kind of raw material. And that's due to the large lacunas in the colonial archive, a difficulty in tracing and preserving textiles themselves, and the marginalization of weavers and textile producers in the global South that kind of continues to this day. And I strongly feel that this needs to be remedied. While the documentation surrounding the specific material origins and makers of the cloth that was sent to the collegiate school in 1718 is quite scarce and scanty, I believe that it's like essential that we attempt to reconstruct their histories as they formed the sort of financial foundation for Yale University. Recently, in terms of things that I'm just sort of discovering, I've been immersed in the records of Fort St. George, which was the center of the East India Company in Madras, which is present-day Chennai in India, of which Elihu Yale served as the governor. And the records detail Governor Yale's initiatives, which included the slave trade within the Indian Ocean. But it also includes the initiative, a very important initiative of Governor Yale, which was to pressurize weaving families to relocate from their ancestral towns and villages in other parts surrounding the area and move to Madras, to an area that was referred to as Blacktown, which was where the natives resided, while the area settled by British and European traders and officials was known as Whitetown. And the motive behind this relocation of weavers into this sort of like urban space was so that British officials could keep a much closer and direct eye over the pace of production of cloth, and which was otherwise being overseen by native people who were dubiously identified kind of as servants or peons in the records, and they were sent by foot between Madras and weaving villages. The extremely frustrating aspect of doing this research has been that the colonial archive essentially appears to only be the only available resource, and the native voice is sort of absent in the colonial archive because the agenda was to erase them. And I also feel like to use these violent archives today as our only resource kind of perpetuates this violence further. And so I've been trying to work really hard to look through other forms of history, oral histories, document narratives among weaving families today in India that can kind of provide a fuller historical picture. And an interesting thing I've recently stumbled across is folk songs or songs that are sung by weavers and using them to build a fuller picture. So if one was just to read the archive itself about how Governor Yale was moving weavers to Madras, then it would seem that the weavers were being incentivized through tax cuts and things like that, which is potentially a good thing. I mean, no harm done. But if one looks at these sort of less privileged sources of knowledge, which includes the actual voice of the weavers, which includes songs that they sang, you kind of see that the way they describe it, those incentives were actually being distributed to middlemen who worked for the East India Company and who were violently forcing weavers to relocate and exponentially increase productivity levels, often at the cost of the weavers' health and well-being. And so I'm trying now to get these songs like well translated and present them in my paper as a sort of foil to the singular narrative within the colonial documents. So yeah, I think like really looking at Yale's place and within a global history of racism and slavery, and the particularities of the wealth of Yale, in this case, through cloth, and how that cloth came to be and the lives it lived after.
Amazing. This is fascinating. And one of my questions later for the professors of this course will be, or maybe a plea, will be please record these presentations so that, and provide them online so that we can all continue to learn from this. This is just really fascinating. Thank you. Donasia, would you like to go next?
Absolutely. So for my presentation, or I guess for my research paper, I am focusing on the Negro College that almost formed in the city of New Haven in 1831. And this is a topic I chose for this class, largely based off of a class I took a couple of years ago with Professor Talia Zamak-Burson that was called Education and Empire. In it, that was the first time I'd ever heard of this Negro College in the city, which really surprised me as someone who was born and raised in New Haven and who really is interested in learning more about Black education. And I think just learning, like as I've begun to uncover more about this history, the fact that it doesn't really have as much memory today really surprises me, and is something that I think we should all work to learn more about, and thinking about the possibilities that would have been had the school been here. But going back to the very preliminary stages of what I've learned so far, essentially this is a school that was going to be brought together by Black and white abolitionists alike. So they wanted to establish an academic institution to educate young African Americans. And the most unprecedented, well, one of the unprecedented parts of it is that it would have been funded by philanthropists of both races. So they really came together and, interestingly enough, did not really consult Yale College or the city of New Haven too much before coming up with this idea and presenting it at the first convention, for the first annual convention of free people of color in Philadelphia, which I think is mostly because they really thought that it would be received well. The reason this college was going to be in the city of New Haven was because this is a quote from them, that there was no place in the Union where the situation of Blacks was more comfortable or the prejudices of a community weaker against them. So they really thought they'd come and they'd meet all of the ministers in New Haven and be well received by the professors at Yale College and the students who were here to kind of advance Black educational opportunities. And they actually were extremely unsupported when the city of New Haven met to have a convention about the college. They actually voted against it 700-4, and not only voted against it legally, but then said they'd do anything in their means to stop it from happening. And that included mobs going into free Black communities in the city of New Haven at the time, and destroying Black businesses, like threatening Black people, also physically harming white people who are in support of this college as well. Another reason that they had for going against it, besides just general fear at the time, as more African Americans were coming into the city, of the safety of white women, or just violence overall, or thinking about the threat that Black intellectual advancement might have on the city at the time, and the potential to start thinking more about abolition on a broader scale in the country. These are all things that really frightened people, and is a lot of where some of their opposition came from. But it was really interesting, since we actually had a chance to go into the Beinecke for our last couple of classes for this on these topics. And when talking to Michael Morand there, he actually added a lot more history that I hadn't heard of when I originally learned about the Negro College. And in addition to the typical reasons that many white people had at the time for not being in support of this college, other things that factored into it were the fact that Yale was having a commencement the very next week, at the same time that they were launching their first annual fundraising campaign of $100,000 that was geared towards alumni. So the college really was thinking more about what it was that alumni wanted, and this Negro College was not something that they wanted Yale professors to be a part of or the community to have in general. And it's really interesting to potentially be tracing the historicity of that, since I know thinking about alumni-driven campaigns is something that's really prominent today. Besides that, another factor to opposition to the college is the fact that Nat Turner's insurrection in Virginia had happened very recently, and news of it was just arriving to the city of New Haven in late August, and people were meeting to talk about this in September. So that definitely was another contributing factor in the opposition. And then finally, I'm really interested in studying just the significance that this had, not just on the city of New Haven, but also on Black education overall. It turns out there's a school in Canterbury, Connecticut, that was educating Black women at the time. But once this resolution in New Haven found, Canterbury thought, if cosmopolitan New Haven isn't going to have a Black college, why should we? And they shut down their school in 1834. And that was something that ended up being cited in the Dred Scott case. So this is something that not only has local implications, but also state and national ones, and even international ones, as other countries were looking at New Haven for this and discussing it. So I'm really excited to delve more into this, and yeah, both for that reason and just imagining like what would it be like today had this college been established in New Haven, and Black free people from different communities had sent their children here.
Thank you. It's something that we talked about earlier this week, where I was saying, where would not just Yale be, but New Haven, our country, and maybe even the world be, had they established this college, and had other cities and towns and universities also followed the lead of Yale. Patrick, let's hear from you.
So my research is focusing on James Philemon Holcomb, who's a graduate of Yale College and attended the University of Virginia Law School and became a professor there, teaching constitutional law. And I'm planning to focus on his writings, his speeches, and other things of that nature that in which he used the law. He used his position as a professor and a person of authority to not only promote slavery, but to say that, in fact, slavery and secession was the only way that the South could continue their harmful practice of slavery, and to keep it up in a way that they found to be the best, relations between the races. And this topic interests me as a person from the South, where our race is full of the Civil War, obviously, and so really Professor Holcomb's work, I'm going to try to put it in conversation with, John C. Calhoun and other people of the time to get at why exactly, they were using their academic credentials to do what they're doing. So Holcomb started out in a family that sold all of their slaves, and they set them free, right? And they would fund those slaves to live in Ohio or to go back to Liberia. This was common in the time. And his family was given an inheritance, which they turned down because it included slaves. And so the tradition of Holcomb and what he's doing, it's not just a story of somebody that's repeating what they've heard from other people, right? And even if it was, that doesn't mean it's okay in any way because he has agency, but it's that he grew up in a family that thought differently than most people in the time about what's going on, or what was going on. And he saw that. He went to Yale, he went to UVA, and he decided that wasn't the way. He decided that he would go contrary to what, like, all of the things that his family practiced, because it was more important for human bondage to be an economic driver and a societal driver of what was going on in the South. And that, to me, just strikes me as so wrong. And I'm going to look at, more of his correspondence. There are other professors at UVA that are thinking differently about this issue, obviously still kind of terrible things, but I really want to understand what's ticking behind this guy, because it's scary. It scares me that this guy exists, and he's obviously not the only one. And in addition to looking at his influence at the University of Virginia, right, this staunch public institution that's been around for so long, it has a major part in the Civil War, and how he used his influence on campus to forward secession. He was a delegate to the Virginia Secession Convention, and he's a big player in these times. And so I'll see where that takes me. We'll just have to see. But I'm thinking about doing a kind of a biography or an intellectual biography of Professor Holcomb.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you again. And actually, Patrick, your earlier response was kind of connected to this next question. So how, and we'll start with Bhasha, but how does this course, the knowledge gained and diving into archival research, how does this impact your experience as a Yale student, given your academic and professional interests and your identities, personally, culturally, et cetera? How do you understand or navigate your experiences as Yale students, or perhaps your futures even? Bhasha?
Yeah, that question really makes me think back to 2019, my first year at Yale, when I was kind of really shocked to discover the first big connection between Yale and other parts of my life, which was a connection between missionaries and early white settlers of the Hawaiian Islands, which is where I'm from, and Yale. And I had been doing some work in the studio at the time around religious conversion as a part of the colonizing project, and how quilt making was introduced to Hawaii by missionaries. Anyways, I sort of fell from the sky when I discovered that the first missionaries to Hawaii came from New Haven and had really deep ties to Yale. And I went into the archives at Yale to look for more information about this. And it was in that process that I completely accidentally stumbled upon documents around Elihu Yale, who I learned was an official in the East India Company, which again shocked me. And then that he had sent cloth as his donation to this university, which felt totally ironic and like bizarrely connected to my work. So I mean, my art practice, even before coming to Yale, was already particularly focused on how the materials and structures of cloth hold interconnected histories of exploitative labor and empire. Being at Yale, I've started to realize that this university itself is at the center of those same histories, and not just metaphorically. And this class has really provided further context for that. But it's also given me hope, because on the one hand, we're uncovering all these histories of the way in which Yale has been structured to perpetuate sort of racist structures, and Yalees have wielded their power to oppress. But on the other hand, I'm personally discovering the sort of full extent of the power that one holds as in being a Yale student and eventual Yale graduate, and trying to think through the ways in which I can perhaps use that power to sort of mend. Through this class, I'm thinking of the ways in which, like, my multiple identities as someone who grew up in Hawaii, as someone of Indian origin, as a weaver, as a quilter, as a painter, how all these things can interact with my identity as a Yale student and potentially make it a very unique and powerful position from which I can take meaningful action, and from which, the work can mean so much more. So that's what I think has been really exciting about this class, and being able to place that within a community of students, who are also doing this work so well. And it's just exciting to see that there's a future to this, and that, like, we need real action to come from this.
It is exciting and agreed with real action and commitment. Donasia, let's hear from you.
Yes, this question is something that I, of course, am thinking about every day, especially depending on what it is exactly we're learning in the class, because I think it definitely has shaped the way in which I interact with Yale's campus and even in the city, as we really are able to ground things in particular places through this class. Earlier, Dean Nelson, when you were talking about Jethro and Gad and other people, and we like learned how close that was to the Yale Law School. Now, every time I'm walking past that space, I'm thinking of them. Similarly, there was an actual location for the 1831 Negro College that would have been on East and Water Street, I believe, in New Haven. So driving past there, I'm thinking this is where this would have happened. So in that sense, it's kind of almost always on my mind. I also mentioned that I work at the admissions office as a tour guide, as a recruitment coordinator, and just in sharing the history of Yale, it definitely has shifted the way in which I do that. And I give pause now after I say in 1716 New Haven, the collegiate school moved to New Haven because of donations of land and tax tax exemptions that are still present today. And I say, like, what does this mean that Yale is giving this voluntary contribution to the city of New Haven? How was this land donated to the city? Whose land was it? Let's talk about this more. So I think in that way, I just am trying to bring it more into my daily experience and remember that these histories aren't things that should be erased or forgotten by any means. And then onto the another aspect of the question, just about how I navigate my experience as a Yale student. Again, this is something that I've been wrestling with for a while. It was particularly difficult as a sophomore when I was taking the Education and Empire class I mentioned before. I'm going to drop this link that I wrote an article. I co-wrote it with my friend Jordan Ashby about some of the findings in this class and also just what that meant for us in being complicit. I remember like really feeling that word and thinking, what does it mean that although I'm studying this university and the history of education overall and its connection to imperialism and control and power and all of these things that I don't believe in, yet I am benefiting from naturally as someone coming to the school and as someone who is advocating for like more inclusion into these spaces. And sometimes I'm like, why exactly is it that I'm doing that? What does that mean? Am I really part of this like social mobility game? Am I further making education and academia something that feels very elite when that is not what I believe knowledge is at all, by nature being part of this university. But, I think each day I kind of approach the topic differently. And right now I'm kind of just sitting with it a lot more and letting it be less of this huge thing that becomes so big in terms of all of the ties that the university has to slavery that it feels almost insurmountable, or like the amount of guilt that becomes something that I don't love the word productive, that isn't really generating any change. Now I really view it in it kind of being my responsibility to think more about how these histories impact today in what I want, and starting to try to imagine where we can go from here as we start to share them with one another. I know I mentioned interning at the Dixwell Community Q House, which is amazing. This was a original settlement house that was founded in 1924 in New Haven, and it's going to offer all of these amazing resources to people in the city. But as I've had conversations with lots of people about it, they say things like every single community in New Haven needs a Q house of its own, or things like that. And just thinking, like, what would it mean if Yale gave more monetary donations to the city? What would it mean if more instances like the true connection that, well, I guess I don't know too much about May Day, although I've been studying it a little bit more. There's just a lovely tea with people who were here during May Day at Yale, but thinking about the way that Yale opened its campus up to people, then thinking, look, what would it look like? Of course, you can't do that today because of the pandemic, but hopefully when we are post it, what would it mean for Yale and New Haven and students and professors and just residents of the city to all actually have relationships with one another and not feel like this Yale bubble is a huge thing that exists. Because for me, I know when I was growing up in New Haven, although certain physical spaces on campus weren't physically closed off to me, I'd never stepped foot on cross campus until I took a tour of Yale. So things like that, and just thinking about how we really tangibly can be making a lot of these shifts today, and seeing where they're happening. Because although that was my experience, it's not everyone's experience. I go to so many talks where there are New Haven residents there, and just thinking about, okay, what spaces are these occurring in? Which ones are they not? And how do we make that shift? So that was a really long response to the question, but that's kind of how I am thinking about my experience and identity in relation to what I'm learning in this class.
It was a wonderful, powerful response to the question. So no worries. And yes, keep on speaking on it. And as someone who also grew up here, that is something that stays on our minds of how we connect and really strengthen the connection between Yale and New Haven, especially Black New Haven, through the work of the Afro-American Cultural Center. So we're so proud of you. We're so proud of you. And Patrick, I'm going to pass it over to you.
On a pretty superficial level, I think that the course it makes me think more, right? Whenever I'm walking around campus, right? Last night, I went with some of my suite mates to the Glee Club concert at Woolsey Hall, and, walking out and said, hey, guys, do you know about the Civil War Memorial? And how it doesn't indicate which side people fought on, and kind of told my suite mates a little bit about that, thanks to Professor Blight talking about it in our class. But I think on a deeper level, really, it's hard, right? I'm pale, male, and Yale, as they say. And so it's hard for me to be able to, it's hard for me to look away, as it should be. And with my work at Data Haven in particular, I'm working on things like trying to figure out how to increase equitable access to entrepreneurship for New Haveners of color. And, looking at the landscape now, it's obviously not anywhere near that. And not just entrepreneurship because we want, capitalism of all races or whatever. It's not that. It's that ownership of community resources really is like a bigger part of that. And to see just the stark disparities that exist there, and then to be able to take this class and look at how Yale has shaped New Haven, Yale has participated in slavery, and then to look at what's going on now, obviously there's a connection. Obviously, if Yale were to have done things differently, the situation now wouldn't be the case. And I think this is also kind of spilled over into my organizing with the Endowment Justice Coalition at Yale, for Yale's endowment not to just be another form of a wealth hoarding, but to be something that really is for the city. And if Yale's for humanity, they wouldn't be hoarding $40 billion. And I'm trying to see all of these things that whenever I'm looking at how the institution acts today, I'm trying to figure out what's changed sometimes, right? In the archives, in the Beinecke, we, with Michael Morand and Professor Blight, we looked at Yale's first capital campaign. They wanted $100,000 raised right after the voting against the new college, the new Black college in New Haven. Literally less than a week later, Yale started its first capital campaign of $100,000. And now I look and I see whenever you drive down Whaley Avenue, there's a 10-year difference in life expectancy. And I see Yale saying we're for humanity. And I see Yale saying that, we need $6 billion more because we don't have enough dollars already, right? And yet they don't pay taxes to the city of New Haven in a way that's equitable, even if it's not required by law. And that's hard, and that's wrong. And that's really how it affects me, because I look like the person that Yale embodies. And so I'm trying to break that mold and to think bigger about what our institution is and what our institution's for.
All right, y'all are really bringing the Lux et Veritas today. Thank you, Patrick, for that. All right, so connecting us to our next session, which is for the attendees, is the concluding roundtable on race, slavery, and Yale's construction of its memory. You all have now had some time at Yale, and in this course, and your research project is underway. You've attended some of these, I hope, conference sessions over the weekend. So given your experiences, your research, and the working group's findings that have been presented over these past few days, what related action items, keyword action items, do you feel the university should commit to as it moves forward with reckoning with these aspects of its past and in its attempts to create a more inclusive Yale? And Bhasha, we'll start with you again.
Yeah, this is like the most important question, and I hope is what all this conference and talking and research is about. I mean, I think as a student in this class, the project is ongoing, and to see it that way is one of the first things that comes to mind. It's important that this class continue to be taught and that more classes like this be put in place and that the research continues, because there's so much more to be uncovered, and that Yale students have to learn these connections and that these histories should not be forgotten or ignored the way that they have been, till today. In relation to my project in particular, I feel like as we're a university that's founded upon an original donation of not only books, but handwoven cloth, Yale needs to be better about funding the study of art and material making, and not only to support art with a sort of capital A as it's done by the Yale Center for British Arts or the Yale University Art Gallery, which is great, but also forms of making that have been historically marginalized by this very university. And that's being very rigorously pursued by many students, like my classmates here at the Yale School of Art, which is currently the school with the least financial funding within the university. So, I mean, I think things like that need to be fixed. But most importantly, and finally, is reparations. Like, reparations need to be made. There needs to be more money given to support Black students in Yale University and to support the Black community of New Haven. I think in the sort of openings panel session of this conference, Elizabeth Alexander had mentioned something about not millions, but billions. And I think that's absolutely correct. So that's what I expect from this university. And I hope that we can do our part in pushing it in that direction.
Thank you, Bhasha. Donasia?
I would definitely echo everything that Bhasha just said. Going back to the first thing you said about the true importance of us being able to study this in this class cannot be like underscored enough. It has been so amazing to be able to be critical of the institution from within it and start thinking about what effect, what changes can occur based off of our findings in this class. But I always think about the fact that this is something that, I don't know, if I wasn't an African-American studies major, how much of this would I know? How much would I feel empowered to change? Would I be asking these same questions? And just thinking about the fact that the 6,200 fellow undergrads and the almost 6,000 like professional school students and graduate schools of arts and sciences are also here. I think just doing more broadly in all the different disciplines to really connect every single one, because almost all of them can be really easily connected to slavery and imperialism and colonialism. So just doing that, not just in AFAM, not just in ERNM, would be amazing. And then also on that note, though, still giving AFAM and ERNM in all of these other departments, like all the same like privileges that other ones have in full departmental status, and making sure that there is representation amongst faculty, and these faculty members are getting support and being honored for their time and their labor, because consistently it is placed on the same people to be doing all of this work, and people aren't always compensated for it, although increasingly are gaining recognition for it. But I just think we should think about the fact that this is something that falls on everyone, and everyone should be stepping up and everyone should be thinking about what their role is personally in this. So I would just like to see a lot more action done pertaining to that and in the way that we're taught in specific classes on that. And then also going to the note about reparations and thinking about the amount of money that Yale is giving to the city of New Haven. We've already talked about this during this panel, but definitely increasing that number, and also not just in a monetary way. This summer, I interned at the Yale farm, which was a really lovely experience. And I had a conversation with a friend there, Charlotte, who was talking. We were talking about calling on Yale to give more money to the city of New Haven, and she said, absolutely yes. But also I am connected to the emergency relief sector of New Haven. And I remember talking to someone and they said there was some time where some kitchen somewhere right before Thanksgiving, like completely broke down. There were all these ovens that weren't working. They had all these turkeys and other things that needed to get cooked. And I believe that the Yale hospitality and catering opened up their ovens, fired them all, like cooked the food, like added some onto that and like brought that out. And I think that was something that I'd consider like to be like an almost neighborly act. And in thinking about like the Yale and New Haven relationship, very frequently we like are taught to think about them as completely separate things. But as someone at Yale who's also from New Haven and meet people every day who are deciding to stay here after graduation and also call the city their home and make it such, I think we should really think about the ways that, like, yes, Yale and New Haven have a very like complicated relationship and at times can act as distinct entities, but in many ways also like we are very much enmeshed and intertwined, as this class shows, and thinking about different like acts like that really just show compassion and care in addition to the monetary donations, of course, though, would just be really really beautiful to see. And I am seeing that in many ways too, in just the ethos that people go into like public service work, et cetera, with, and making sure to amplify the voices of New Haven organizers and New Haven residents and listening to what they want. And I think that's something the university should be doing too. Very frequently we're having all of these meetings and people are saying you need to be hiring more people from lower income neighborhoods in the city of New Haven full time. But are those demands always being met? The answer to that is no. So just being able to continue those conversations and working to meet what people want. I always think it's great that like we as Yale students and people on this call like are asked like what we think the university should do, because we should have responses to that. But I also do think we should remember like who else should be part of these conversations. And I think that's like everyone who has a stake in the city. So also thinking about the ways that Yale can really bring them into it too, and see like what is it that everyone wants, not just our students, not just our alumni, not just our faculty, people in New Haven too. They need to be centered in these conversations.
Indeed, indeed. And let's hear from Patrick.
I really want to echo Donasia's last point that, you know, every stakeholder should be involved in this conversation. And I think that leads to a restructuring of the institution that is the Yale Corporation. If we look at who's on the board, I mean, it's really, really, really not representative of A, just people of color, and B, of people that live in New Haven. And that's wrong. I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, maybe it makes sense in the eyes of the law, or the way that things have always been thought. But, you know, that just strikes me as wrong, that the people who are affected by the decisions of this, you know, the arbitrary decisions, right? They're not democratic decisions, that's for sure. At least not democratic of the people that are involved. You know, I didn't vote on them. Faculty and staff often won't get a choice. You know, we'll just, you know, stamp down academic freedom because somebody gave a bunch of money. I mean, that's not okay. And I don't see how we can move forward if we expect the university to change and to do different things, but we don't change how the university is structured, and we don't change the way that those decisions are made. You know, that doesn't seem right. In addition, I really do want to hit home on Professor Foreman's question and Professor Alexander's statement at the opening panel that this discussion should be in the magnitude of billions. That's just a great starting point. those are the terms in which we should be thinking, right? We can go anywhere from there. As somebody who's from a community that has the largest rural development bank in the country, back in Arkansas, I know what happens whenever you seed money, and like even in the millions, you seed money to lend to marginalized people to build businesses and to build homes, and those sorts of things, because it's happened. And it's happened in a way that's in a type of reparation. And I think more broadly about reparations. So for our class, we read The Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates and The Atlantic, very famous article. And there's one point I want to pull out of it. He says, more important than any single check cut to any African American, the payment of reparations would represent America's maturation of the childhood myth of its innocence into a wisdom worthy of its founders. And I think that really could be applied to Yale in a certain sense. And it's not just that we need to do it because of material impacts, which it is, but it's also that, this childhood myth of our innocence is wrong. And if we continue that way, why would you expect anything different in the future? So that's what I have to say.
All right. I'm hearing a hashtag research and reparations. Obviously, this conference focuses on the research, and now with the findings, the university will be responding, and we'll see where things go. And I think each of you have really challenged here, but also in your work outside of the classroom as well, have really challenged the university to kind of step up and to fully make a commitment to responding to these. Let's see, I'm going to pass it now to Crystal and Ed. Crystal Feimster and Ed Rugemer, they are the instructors for this class. And so my question for you all, and doesn't have to be in any particular order, what were your motivations for creating this course?
I thank you, Risë, for moderating this very important panel. The motivations for creating the course were simply to invite student engagement, and I think that's clearly been effective and that's evidenced by the testimony of Donasia, Patrick, and Bhasha. It's there, as has been observed, Yale is a little bit late to the game in exploring this question, and there is a precedent for these courses. I know we early in the meetings of the working group, we heard from a lot of people involved in similar projects at other universities. And this type of course has been taught at Harvard, at Princeton, and Georgetown, and a lot of places. And I thought it was, Crystal and I thought it was very important that we do that here as well. I also think it's a very good way to get the students into some of the into the Beinecke, into the British Art Center. We had a session, Michael Moran brought us through a lot of the archival materials that demonstrate the role that slavery played in the making of this institution. And then we went to the British Art Center, and we sat with the portrait of Elihu Yale and the enslaved child. And we learned from Ed Town all the research that they've been doing on that painting, which was featured yesterday. And these are really special opportunities to be able to do that, and it was really wonderful to be able to bring the students in. I don't know if you have something to add, Crystal, to that.
I want to join you in thanking Risë for this conversation, and moreover the work that you do at the house, and some of the work that actually it predates the teaching that we're doing, particularly with our African-American studies majors, like Rod Walker, who's worked on the thing, and Rebecca Amanor through the history. Oh, why am I blanking on the name? But the history, what do you call them, Risë?
History keepers.
History keepers, right, I'm sorry. I want to just call them historians, but I took, for me, in some ways, taking on this class and co-teaching it with Ed, required me to step out of my comfort zone a little bit in terms of most of my classes, as you know, are taught in 20th century African-American history. But as a participant of the working group and as a historian who has spent much of my career working in the archives and training graduate students and undergraduates to work in the archives and learn how to be historians, right? And to be professional historians as well as amateur historians or undergraduate historians, and understanding this course is being a part of that project and that work. I felt like, oh, I could step in and co-teach this with Ed. And I also felt it was an opportunity for me to learn more about this history and Yale's relationship and connections with New Haven, its relationships and connections to the enslavement of African Americans and Indigenous people. So it was a no-brainer, but I also think it fits with a sort of larger agenda that I have as a historian and an activist who thinks of all of my classes as really, and any student who takes a class with me, I always say, this class is a call to action. Right, that I have a task as an educator to train you in a certain skill set as historians, but I also understand that the past is not dead, right? That the past is always present, and we can feel that's palpable in this course. But whether I'm teaching 20th century African American history and teaching about the May Day events here in New Haven, or teaching my kids about Pauli Murray, right? Who had connections to Yale, that I'm always saying to them, what are you going to do with this knowledge? Right? How are you going to mobilize it for social good and social justice? And so I think one of the things that it's not a hard push, because many of the students like Bhasha, Donasia, and Patrick who come into these classes are already attuned to that work, right? And so we're just giving them the tools and the knowledge to really go out there and do the thing that they want to do. So it was a no-brainer. That was what motivated me to join Ed in teaching this course, because I knew I would learn from him, and I knew it would be an opportunity to work with students who want to challenge Yale to do better.
Thank you for that. I love that the call to action. At this point, we're going to move to answering some questions from our audience. We've got some great ones in the chat. You all in the audience, continue to send in your questions through the Q&A, and we will try to get to as many as we can. And for our panelists, you have many kudos and congratulations, saying what an excellent job you are doing, and they can't wait to see what you produce. So let's see here. I am going to, and this is, I'm not going to mention the names just in case the writer does not want their name mentioned. Here is one. After yesterday's panel on finding slavery in the archives, the Wikipedia description of Connecticut Hall reads a lot differently with its blatant lack of information about enslaved people who built it. Do you think, though it's kind of basic, that some of these public-facing descriptions of Yale can be changed or edited? And I'll open that up to any of our student panelists.
Yes. I'll go first and say yes. I think that that's really important.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly second that. I think especially because a lot of work is being done to already uncover this, like the Yale and Slavery working group has a lot of this information already, and if not this group, other departments do as well. Just from currently taking an urban studies course, I know that they frequently are also researching a lot of similar things about who's building some of the buildings, the histories involved in those, and really bringing that to life. And I think if this work is already out there, or if it isn't, it can easily become a part of what we're doing. Why should that be something that stays isolated to those spaces in which people choose to engage with it? It really should be commemorated and shared. And yeah, the most basic ask.
I'll also add to that. I think I was reading about a project that the library is working on right now about updating a lot of its descriptions in the archives, and in I think that's going to spread across campus as well, to make sure that they are more historically accurate and inclusive as well. So it'll be really great and interesting to see what comes of that. This other question comes in, do you think that one way to repair the harm that Yale caused as a result of its role in slavery would be to increase the recruitment of African-American New Haven residents to Yale? I'm assuming you mean that as students, but that could also be recruitment as faculty, staff, administrators, etc. So if you all would like to answer that.
Yes, I think absolutely. Yale should be opening up, accepting more students, faculty, staff, etc., from people within New Haven, or at least giving people the option if it feels like something that's really closed off to them, and maybe they don't want to come to Yale as students, but maybe they do. And I think that Yale really does have a duty to increase the number of local students that they're taking, which I believe they are most years right now, and increasing the number of students of color and Black students and Indigenous students that it's accepting each year, and making sure, again, that not only are they just increasing the number of students that they're accepting, but on the other hand, making sure that they're subsequently increasing the number of resources and support that these students will be able to get when they get to school here. So we don't just have a large number of BIPOC students or people from other marginalized identities who are here, but really struggling in a predominantly white space. So I think it goes twofold, which is why, although I had a very enthused yes initially, I really do think when thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice work, we can't just think about like representation and inclusion in that sense, because you have to think, what does it mean to truly be including students? You can't just say, let's bring you in, and then like people might be set up to fail when they get here, and that's like in the sense of most predominantly white institutions or spaces, whether it be private high schools, private colleges, like different like office spaces, etc. That's true everywhere. So I really think Yale has to make some tangible changes now on our end for students who are already here, but should also be bringing in more people.
Yeah, I thank you for that, Donasia. I think like I was hesitant to immediately say a yes, because I was thinking kind of about who does the work fall upon to sort of make Yale a less racist institution, and should all that pressure be placed on just students of color or Black students? That's not necessarily enough. I think another way also, rather than just thinking of bringing in Black residents of New Haven into the university as students, I think there's the idea that a lot of educational infrastructure is being built by the university and can be extended to the community without them having to enroll necessarily as students. I think how can Yale University support like the Yale New Haven public school systems, for example, things like that, which I think right now Yale kind of keeps really close to themselves. It'd be really great to see if there were ways to bring Black New Haven residents into Yale in sort of these more informal ways that would be extending and meeting them in their spaces, but providing infrastructure that's already in place.
I'd like to echo Donasia and Bhasha. And just to say that oftentimes, like, so I think, yes, definitely, the university should be doing that. However, I'd be a little afraid of the university kind of patting themselves on the back for doing it, and then not addressing issues like educational inequity or mass incarceration and things like that that stem from, their past harms. But absolutely, yes, this should be part of the conversation.
Yeah, so sorry to jump back in, so Dean Nelson, but I also very quickly forgot to mention the New Haven Promise, which is something that is happening, I believe, still currently. I remember my mom talking about it a lot when I was a student.
Runs it, alum as well.
Yeah, but it is a scholarship that does like pay tuition for students from New Haven public schools in certain charter schools to attend public colleges or universities, which I think is really amazing. So expanding things like that. And even with something like that, though, thinking about ways in which it can be better improved, because I know it has so many different stipulations. And just thinking about one after like a very quick glance on their website again about it, and just seeing things like you must have a positive disciplinary record during high school, like how might that impact people? Why, like, let's talk about the fact that